Hello, welcome to Weekly Update. My name is Bill Galvano. Today's guest is Representative Mark Flanagan. Mark Flanagan was elected to the Florida House in 1994 and served 4 consecutive terms thereafter until he finally had to leave because of term limits. But Mark served during a time in our state's history where there was a lot of transition. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Bill.
Well, thank you, Mark. Why don't you start by telling us about 1994, when you ran, and what the state of Florida looked like from a Tallahassee perspective?
Well, first of all, the state of Florida had been run by a Democratic majority since 1874. And going into the election of 1994, which was my first election, the prospect of Republicans taking the majority was a very slim prospect. Well, the reality is that we won, and we were very close to taking the majority within 3 seats. And as a freshman member of the minority party, I had a seat in the back row, and we worked diligently and prepared for the elections of '96.
So let me get this straight. You ran as a Republican, correct?
Yes.
And you were running as a minority party member at that time.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the member that served in the seat was a Democrat who chaired a committee, and I was successful in our campaign in unseating the incumbent. And my reward by the majority party, the Democratic Party, was a back seat on the House floor in the chamber.
And so our viewers understand, when you're in the chamber, there are 120 seats, and those seats are not assigned alphabetically, they're not assigned by tenure, but they're assigned by the speaker, who is of one party or the other, based on leadership roles and party affiliation.
Oh, absolutely. The speaker is a dictator, hopefully a benevolent dictator, but the speaker rules. And the speaker decides where you're going to sit on the floor. The speaker decides where your office is going to be. The speaker decides where your parking spot's going to be. So I felt very fortunate that I at least had a seat on the floor. And the fact that I didn't have a parking spot, that didn't bother me.
So you had to park over by the mall and catch the shuttle?
Yes.
Who was the speaker at that time?
Peter Rudy Wallace from St. Petersburg, who had served in the legislature a number of years. And he is a good man.
So you were a member of a minority party that had picked up some seats then?
Yes. I believe the breakdown was, after the election of '94, there were 63 Democrats, and there were 57 of us House Republicans. So I, in fact, served in the last Republican minority in the state of Florida, because in my reelection in '96, we took the majority by 1 vote. We actually had a 61-59 majority, which was historic, Bill, because of the fact that Florida became the first state in the country to have a Republican majority take over the legislature since Reconstruction.
So you went from a minority member in your first term, your first two-year term, to really what is barely a majority in your second term, which began in 1996.
Correct. The last Republican speaker was a man from Lake City area, Malachi Martin, in 1874. We had not had a Republican speaker since 1874. And in 1996, we elected the first Republican speaker in the Florida legislature.
Who was?
Dan Webster, who went on to be probably one of the greatest speakers to serve in the Florida legislature. He went on to the Florida Senate, and now serves us in the United States Congress.
So what changed? Obviously your seat moved.
What changed was, oh my God, on many levels. First and foremost was our approach to criminal justice. In the first days of our majority in 1996, as we approached the session of 1997, we had fashioned a criminal justice package that was the bellwether for the rest of the country in terms of pieces of legislation that included minimum mandatory sentences served. For example, 85% is the amount that one has to serve once convicted. Also, 3 strikes and you're out is another piece of that landmark criminal justice legislation that passed, as well as welfare reform. We became the first state in the country to pass real, meaningful welfare reform, which was actually named Work and Gain Economic Self-Sufficiency, wages.
Mark, was there a learning curve, if you will, for the Republicans at that time, going from being in the minority for over a century into becoming the majority party? Did you as that first class, so to speak, feel that there was a learning curve?
Well, absolutely. For me personally, there was a learning curve in that I was the first person in my family to ever serve in elected office. But in general, the Republican conference in the Florida legislature at that time never allowed itself to have a minority mentality. So even in my first term, in my first 2 years, the leadership and the guidance that I had from those Republican members who had served, Dan Webster, John Thrasher, Jim King, for example, they instructed us and schooled us to think in terms of the best public policy for the state of Florida, and that best public policy approach would then determine our politics.
From a procedural standpoint, did you see a lot of change, or was it just simply that you had now were in the majority and the daily routines were the same?
Oh, wow. Dan Webster, as Speaker, turned the pyramidal structure, if you will, of the Florida legislature upside down. In other words, for over a century, the Florida legislature had been a very strict pyramid of power. In other words, at the top of the pyramid was the Speaker. And then right underneath the Speaker, you had the Appropriations Chair and the Rules Chair. And for a century, those 3 men ruled the Florida House of Representatives. Dan Webster's approach was to take that pyramidal structure and turn it upside down. In other words, to broaden the base of representation, because he believed, as we all believed, that each and every member of the Florida legislature, all 120, are elected by their constituents to do a job, and therefore each individual has to be given that respect and opportunity to serve their constituents regardless of their party affiliation. So Dan clearly turned the pyramidal structure of power upside down.
And Dan also, Speaker Webster and Senator Webster, Congressman Webster, was on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, too. And I think that probably played into his decision making.
Well, his experience absolutely benefited all of us, and it shaped his leadership style in that he came in himself in 1980. So by the time I was elected in 94, he had already had 14 years of experience, and that experience benefited new members and the new majority that we achieved in 96 and grew in 98. And continued to grow in the 2000 elections, and to this point, our Republican majority has grown and has served the state well, and has served in many areas as an example to other state legislatures in this country.
Now, at that same time, there was a transition in the Senate, too.
In 1994, the Senate actually achieved parity. In other words, of the 40 senators, 20 were Democrat and 20 were Republican. So that was the first time that the Republicans actually had an equal footing. They actually shared the Senate president's seat. The Democrats had that chair one year, and the Republicans had the chair the next year.
So at this time, we're still having a transition, one that has now lasted through present day. Today we have supermajorities in both chambers. What about the executive branch? Who was governor when you were elected?
Lawton Chiles. Lawton Chiles was actually reelected to his second term in 1994 when I was first elected. And his style of leadership is a classic style, a very fair man, a very good man. In fact, I miss him. Many people miss him to this day because he was a hard worker and a smart worker and put the interests of all Floridians first and foremost in his mind.
Well, he had some learning to do on his part as well because he was a Democrat governor dealing with a Democratic legislature. And now, all of a sudden, he's got parity in one chamber, and then a majority by the Republicans and a majority in the House. So, any comment on how he may have had to adjust?
Well, I can tell you that we, as the new majority in '96, gave Governor Lawton Chiles his first veto override. So that was new to him. Now, Governor Lawton Chiles, being in his second term, had never had any vetoes overridden, and we gave him his first veto override.
So our viewers understand what you're talking about. By veto override, you mean that the governor had vetoed a bill that the Democratic governor had vetoed a bill that the Republican legislature had sent to him, and under the laws of the state of Florida, constitutionally and bolstered by statute, you all could come back and by 2/3 vote to override that veto and make your bill law despite the action of the governor.
Exactly. That's exactly what we did. He had vetoed a number of pieces of legislation, and one in particular, Speaker Webster and the Republican conference, as well as a large number of Democratic members felt should be the law of and the policy of the state of Florida. So we all agreed and had the votes, and we overturned Governor Lawton Chiles' veto on a piece of legislation. Actually, it was a partial birth abortion legislation that he had vetoed that we overturned.
So now let's get back on the timeline. You've come in at '94. As a minority party member. Now in 1996, you have moved into the majority. The Senate's is doing the same thing. You have a Democrat as governor, but then in 1998, we have a gubernatorial election, and tell us what happened.
Jeb Bush was elected. He became the first elected Republican governor since Claude Kirk, and Jeb had been preparing for the potential of winning the election and becoming governor, in that he had run unsuccessfully in 1994. It was a very close election that he lost to Lawton Chiles.
That was the old he-coon.
Yes. And Jeb had been preparing and had a huge agenda. The hallmark of his agenda had to do with educational reform. And the crown jewel of Governor Jeb Bush's educational reform package was what we call now the A-plus program that has been, again, as other pieces of legislation that the Republican conference passed, Governor Bush's A-plus package has become a model for educational reform to this day because it included the establishment of charter schools, which we had never had in Florida. It established the creation of choice in schools, which we had never had, and a number of other provisions, including the grading of schools, the standardization of tests, and the accountability of results in terms of merit pay for those schools and those teachers who perform the best.
All of these very, very bold reforms. Do you think that just given the momentum at the time, it lent itself to these type of reforms?
Yes, and I think it has so much to do with the long-term planning and preparation that had gone into the potential of a Republican majority and what Republicans would do with the chance to lead. So
that's a great point. Now let's talk a little bit about that. Because obviously the goal of each party is to be that majority party and to be the party in control. And we hear it every day on the news, and we watch election cycles to see the outcomes. But you bring up an interesting perspective that you almost had ideas in the queue, if you will, that waiting on deck for that opportunity to come.
That's very well put. And many of the ideas weren't new ideas. However, they were ideas that made sense in terms of the potential for improving the life and the quality of life for all Floridians, whether it be the classroom for our students and teachers, or for our businessmen and women around the state, or for the agriculture, all the growers in the state, as well as tourists, improving the state on all those levels. And I would tell you, Bill, that we in the Republican Conference had some basic guiding principles. And those principles had to do with guidelines in regards to how we viewed legislation. And if the legislation improved the quality of life, reduced the size and the scope of government, reduced the burden of taxation on Floridians, and provided for individual responsibility,
impacts family,
and family empowerment, then those pieces of legislation would have a chance of seeing the light of day in a Republican majority.
In '98, when Governor Bush came in, you picked up more seats, correct?
Yes.
Where were the numbers, if you recall, at that point?
We went again from a one-vote majority in the '96 re-elect to growing up to 73 members, I believe, in '98. And I believe, Bill,
73 out of 120.
Yes. So we had not a supermajority. In other words, we didn't have a two-thirds majority. You, Bill, you served in that historic biennium with a supermajority where
under Alan Bentz.
Yes.
Speaker Bentz.
But again, we had an unofficial supermajority because there were a large number of Democratic members who shared our values, who shared our principles, that we worked closely with on a bipartisan basis, respecting each other's opinions and respecting each other's party affiliations. But when we were in session and in committee, we were focused first and foremost on the best public policy for Floridians.
Which makes sense if you were able to have the veto overrides.
Yes, absolutely. And with a Republican governor and a Republican cabinet as well, the threat of veto certainly was there. Jeb Bush used his veto pen a lot, but it wasn't as much of a concern in that together with the executive branch led by Governor Bush, the Florida legislature, particularly the House of Representatives, leadership worked closely with Governor Bush and his administration on public policy initiatives.
Well, as a member of the legislature, you work on a daily basis with the agency heads and the policy implementers, if you will. And when you have a change at the gubernatorial level, the personnel changes within the agencies and the structure actually changes. Can you comment on that and how you saw that change really overnight during that period?
Bill, your question raises a number of very important points. Number one, when members are elected or re-elected, whether it be in the legislative branch or the executive branch, they serve for a brief period of time and they make certain changes. However, within the ranks of the permanent government, if you will, the bureaucrats, there are no term limits. So in other words, when, in my view, a governor is new and picks new secretaries of agencies, they come in, those new secretaries, say Secretary of Transportation, they come into an organization that has many, many individuals who have been in their positions for many, many years. So it's very difficult, in my opinion, for a new governor and his new secretaries of his divisions to really make the changes necessary to provide the type of public policy that the people of Florida are demanding in regards to meaningful change.
But we saw a beginning of that change with Governor Bush, with the...
Yes, we did, and Governor Bush, beginning with his transition team, all the way through his 8 years. And by the way, Governor Bush was historic in Florida in that he was the first Republican governor ever to be reelected. So he had 8 years, yes, ever in the history of Florida. And he still stands as the only Republican governor to ever be reelected. So hopefully that record will be tied, but as of yet, he holds that record himself. And he did, Bill, set the stage and began the change within the state of Florida's government agencies to reduce the size and the scope of government, to eliminate unnecessary rules and regulations. There is still a lot of work to be done, no question. And that work would not be in progress if it wasn't for the efforts of a Republican majority in the legislature, as well as a Republican governor.
Now, everyone knows Governor Bush's brother was President Bush. You were serving in 2000, and we went from 94 to 96. The 98 Governor Bush comes in. In 2000, you were in the Florida legislature when we had the vote contest. Tell me about that.
That was an incredible period of time on a number of levels, Bill. First and foremost, it was a re-election for me in 2000, and I had a re-election campaign, and we were successful in winning our re-election. And at the same time, it was a presidential cycle where it was a very heated contest. As a matter of fact, I myself was chairman of the elections committee in the Florida House of Representatives.
At that time?
At the time. And in addition, I also was a supporter of then Governor of Texas, George Bush, in going door to door for him. As a matter of fact, a group of us flew up to New Hampshire and walked precincts in the primary season for him. We also flew up to South Carolina and walked precincts and handed out Manatee County strawberries and oranges to the residents. And so you had then...
So it went beyond just your role as a member of the House of Representatives. This was a part of the political process and something that you were engaged in.
Very much so. And it was very unique historically in terms of Election Day. And as many of us will remember, the election was put in question on that day because of the uncertainty of the state of Florida and which way the state of Florida had gone. The uniqueness of our then speaker, Tom Feeney, benefited the state and the country, in my view, greatly in that he called me as chairman and had a conversation with me on election evening about his thoughts and my thoughts about what was going to happen. And Tom Feeney, who went on to serve in Congress, is a brilliant, brilliant legal scholar. And he shared with me the potential of what could possibly happen. And he also shared with me the solutions to prevent the outcome, the potential outcome, and that is that the state of Florida needed to ratify its slate of electors. And at that point, Florida was undecided. So we went into a special session where we...
And describe what was going on around the Capitol at that point.
Well, it was 36 days of an election contest. As a matter of fact, again, it began with my reelection and our reelection as a new majority again. At the same time, we were dealing with something that had only happened once in our country. As a matter of fact, it happened and it involved Florida in 1876 election, where the election of president was put in contest. And the Gore campaign fought very hard in such a way as to, we thought, have the day come and go when the Electoral College met and voted. And if the Electoral College were to meet without a ratified slate of electors for the state of Florida, by the way, the ratified slate of electors is held within the National Archives. When Florida's name was called, if there was no ratified slate of electors present to vote, then Florida would not have had a voice in the election. So we felt very strongly after 3 recounts, all 3 had put George W. Bush as the victor. We felt very certain that the voice of Florida needed to be heard, and we were successful. We had some help with the United States Supreme Court on the 36th day that ratified and certified the election too. So it was a hearing.
And every media outlet, Florida was the center of the universe at that point.
Oh my gosh, it was for 36 days. And I think during that period especially, I would imagine that many across this country, if anything, they got a lesson in civics in terms of how government works and how a president is elected, and how the founding fathers were so brilliant in perceiving the potential of just what it was that Florida was going through in the 2000 election. And the United States Constitution works. We were able to work within the United States Constitution, and we were successful as a legislature under the leadership of Speaker Feeney to ensure that Florida's vote would count in that election.
And it was an example of the civility of the people of the United States, that even in such a situation where in many other nations throughout the world you may have seen it escalate into violence, frankly, we were able to address it within the parameters of our legislative procedure and our legal procedure.
Yes, that's a very good point. As a matter of fact, it's very important to note during that period that never once did anyone or any organization ever assert or allege that in any way our election had been a fraudulent election. No one ever alleged that there was any corruption in our process. The only question on the part of Vice President Gore was a question of the number of votes.
And how they were counted.
And we counted them 3 times. So
we're running short on time, but I do want to touch on yet another historic moment during your service, 9/11/2001. You were a member of the Florida House. Tell us about that.
Well, that was a day that I was looking forward to, in that I had received a call in my office inviting me to be in attendance at the elementary school in Sarasota, Booker Elementary, on the morning of September 11th, 2001. So I woke up that morning very excited to be in the presence of President Bush. And as we gathered in the classroom and then in the adjacent library of Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, it wasn't too long before we became aware of what it was that had occurred in New York City, that our nation was under attack. And it was just a surreal experience to then leave that event where I was on my way to Tallahassee, where we had committee meetings, and of course the airlines were all shut down for over a week. And as a matter of fact, our committees didn't meet. So for a number of days, as well as a full week, our nation almost shut down. The stock market closed for a week. It was a very unique period, again, to be like the election contest of 2000 on the occasion of 9/11, to be an active participant during those 2 historic events.
Representative Flanagan, thank you for being here.
Thank you, real pleasure.
Very interesting service in the Florida House, many historic events, and we appreciate you sharing them with us. Thank you all for joining us this week on Weekly Update.